Welcome back to another episode of Analyzing the Apocalypse. We are resuming our conversation about the book of Revelation, and we're in chapter 7 of this book, having wrapped up chapter 6 in our previous conversation. But just to briefly revisit that chapter, we had talked about it in two different parts, because the first part, of course, refers to the so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse. I felt like that was worthy of its own conversation. And then the latter part of that chapter dealt with the fifth and the sixth seals of what was being revealed about God's message of judgment. And all of those seals were different from each other in different ways, but they all referred basically to God's message of either judgment or comfort for his people. And we kind of left on a cliffhanger, though, because at the end of chapter 6, there was that question in the final part of it, where the people of earth who are being judged and they're facing this divine calamity that's come upon them for their sins, they asked that question, and who is able to stand? So if you look at the end of chapter 6, you'll see that final question in that chapter. And it really is what leads up into chapter 7 then, because chapter 7 ultimately answers that question. So chapter 7 is unique because it's not a chapter of judgment. It doesn't have a lot of negativity in it, if you want to consider Revelation to be a book of negativity in some respects. It's actually a chapter of comfort and of great goodness in that respect, especially regarding the context of those who would have read this book to begin with. And we're going to see this again later in chapter 14, but this is the first time it surfaces here. And it kind of relates to some things we've already talked about with the seven churches, but also in the past chapter, in chapter 6, with the fifth seal specifically. We'll see some of the same information come forth in chapter 7. We're going to read the entirety of chapter 7 here in this episode, and then we'll get into our slideshow and start going through the details of the text and trying to understand what all this means. So I'm going to invite you to read with me in Revelation chapter 7. We're going to begin with verse 1, and we'll read down to the end of the chapter together. After these things I saw four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of those who were sealed. 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed. Of the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Gad, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Asher, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Simeon, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Levi, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Issachar, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Joseph, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000 were sealed. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. All the angels stood around the throne, and the elders and the four living creatures, and fell on their faces before the throne and worshipped God, saying, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom, thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen. Then one of the elders answered, saying to me, Who are these arrayed in white robes, and where did they come from? And I said to him, Sir, you know. So he said to me, These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God, and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will dwell among them. They shall neither hunger any more, nor thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them, and lead them to the living fountains of waters. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Much different from what we've read in Revelation up to this point. We've seen glimpses of this, but I believe chapter 7 is the first time we've really encountered a chapter that is almost solely focused on comfort and encouragement, especially regarding the seven churches of Asia that were facing significant backlash for their faith in Jesus. In seeing a chapter like this, we can understand why this would have been so significant to them. But why does this chapter exist? And how is it that it really offers this pause? Because, from chapter 6, after we saw the six seals open, chapter 6 ended and it was quite terrifying. It was a horrifying scene to envision that the powers of the earth are shaken, that there's this significant upheaval happening in the world, and everything is being turned on its head. And you'd expect that in the following chapter, it all just comes crashing down, but it doesn't, at least not yet. There is this pause, an intermission, as it were. So God is not offering much judgment or condemnation here, really none at all in this chapter, quite the opposite. It's really a description of God's care and of how he takes care of his people, even if they do suffer for his sake. Because as we're going to talk about as we go through the details of this chapter, it all comes back to that same idea that God takes care of his people, and he knows who they are, and he knows what they have done, and none of that is lost on him, which, of course, should provide significant comfort. So to that end, let's begin just at the very first part of this chapter in Revelation chapter 7 and talk about how it describes this situation. So in the first 3 verses, we have different angelic beings that are accomplishing different tasks. So notice in verse 1, there are 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth. Now, think about that for just a moment. You've read in Scripture before about the 4 corners of the earth. That is clearly a symbol because it's not describing the earth as a cube. It's not describing the earth as a square. That's not at all the intention. It's just a description in an accommodative way, in a symbolic way, to describe the entirety of the earth, the whole of earth. If you go back to Zechariah chapter 6, you see the same type of thing where those horsemen and those chariots that we talked about in Revelation chapter 6 and verses 1 through 8, they come from the 4 corners of the earth. So it, again, is a description of the entirety of earth. That's the way that's to be taken, not to be understood as a literal description of how the earth is structured geographically. But they're standing at the 4 corners of the earth, and they're holding back the 4 winds of the earth. And it says that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree because of their efforts. That's an interesting detail because the wind that's in view here would almost certainly be judgment and calamity in general. So it's not really giving any specificity to that judgment or calamity. It's just saying the angels are holding back further judgment, which ties back to the previous chapter as far as answering that question of why does this chapter exist and what is it trying to do. It's showing us that there is a brief intermission on judgment, and it's alerting us to that in the very first verse to let us know that this is going to be a little different before it resumes with the 7th seal in chapter 8. But then verses 2 and 3, we have another angel who comes. So where there's 4 angels, they're holding back the wind, and there's another angel that comes out of the east, and he has the seal of the living God, and he cries out to these other 4 angels and tells them they cannot let go of those 4 winds. They cannot stop doing what they're doing until the servants of God have been sealed. And this is where things get interesting from here, because verses 4 through 8, I would venture to say, are some of the most misunderstood passages in the book of Revelation. And that's to say there's a lot of them, but I would say this is one that really stands out to me as one that's easy to misunderstand and easy to misapply. So what is this angel talking about? What is going on here about this sealing? What does that mean? So we haven't really talked too much about this concept. We saw it in the conversation we had about the 7 churches because there was a reference to it, but it was a very brief reference. To be sealed in the ancient world, though, was a reference to ownership or even possession. In fact, this still happens today, but in a different context. You talk about branding an animal, and regardless of how you feel about branding an animal, that is the seal of the owner. That is the farmer or whoever owns that animal putting a seal on that animal to let other people know who it belongs to. So it has a practical purpose. So if the animal wanders off the property and ends up somewhere else, someone can find it and bring it back to the rightful owner, that sort of issue. So that's how sealing was understood in the ancient world. And slaves were also people that would have been branded in a similar way, not as brutally in some cases, of course, sometimes that did happen, unfortunately. But nevertheless, that was a common practice for people to be branded that way, to be sealed that way, to indicate ownership or possession. Even more significantly than the culture, we see in Ezekiel chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, I wouldn't say a similar passage, but I would say it explains this passage in Revelation chapter 7 a little bit as far as the idea of sealing. Because in that chapter, you're seeing a situation where before God sends out judgment upon Jerusalem to wipe out idolaters and other evildoers, he says that there are people that need to be sealed because they are upset about what's taking place. They're not going along with idolatry, rather they resist it and they're upset about it. And those people are sealed and they are spared from judgment. They are not going to be caught up in the same flood of judgment that the others will be. That is the background and context for what we see here in Revelation chapter 7. That's the whole point of the sealing. And that goes back to what the angel says in verse 3. Don't let the winds of the earth come back on the earth until after these people have been sealed. indicating that there needs to be a stay in judgment until these people are identified, until they are shown to be owned by God and taken care of by Him, and then judgment can go on from there. So again, goes back to what we've already talked about regarding the stay of judgment and the reason why that was given. But what about the number and the identification of these people here in Revelation chapter 7? So we have the 144,000. And that's an interesting idea in its own right, because in the 144,000, that number is something that is interpreted in a variety of ways, and unfortunately not in many good ways. But really, simply put here, the reason you have 144,000 is that you have 12,000 servants of God from each tribe in Israel, and there's 12 tribes of Israel. I'll point out some details here that help us understand how to reconcile all of this. So I'll say right off the bat, this is not meant to be a literal number. That is a common doctrine that goes around. It's taking details that are embedded in a symbolic context. The whole chapter is dealing with symbolism, everything before and everything after it. So why then would this all of a sudden be taken literally, as some groups do, unfortunately, when it's pretty clear it's pointing at something symbolically? It's trying to point out here that there's a large number of God's faithful, a large number of people who are sealed, that it's not just a handful of people. It's not some people are getting missed. It's intended to capture the whole of God's faithful people. Now, as far as the idea that this is a mass conversion of Jewish people to Christ, as much as we would wish that would be true, that is not at all what this is talking about. It is clear in verse 4, and verse 3 for that matter, that these are already servants of God. And the reading of the New Testament makes it pretty clear the Jewish nation rejected God and rejected Christ. I would find it quite strange for them to be referred to as servants of God when they had rejected Him and His plan through Jesus. So some significant problems emerge when we start looking at this in ways the text doesn't really indicate. Because again, if we keep it simple, we see 144,000 here is composed of the 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 servants of God, depicting all the faithful, from the past, from the present, and from the future. The furthest I would take this, the absolute furthest I would take this, is to say that this refers to Jewish Christians specifically. So remember, in the first century, you did have Jewish Christians, and I hesitate to use that type of terminology, but I just mean people of a Jewish background that converted to Christianity. So those people might be in view here. Because in verse 9, we're going to see, and we've already read it, there's this great multitude that no one can number. So clearly it's not just the 144,000. There's other people present at this occasion as well, but these are highlighted and shown in this particular case, denoting that God is taking care of them, denoting that God is protecting them, that He knows who they are. They're not lost on Him. And that is the focus here in verses 4 through 8, and also the rest of the chapter for that matter. So in all of this, we're seeing God's faithful people depicted in a variety of ways. It's really no different from the 24 elders, where you have the 12 apostles and the 12 tribes of Israel that are kind of brought together in the 24 elders to represent in totality the faithful of God. I would say the 144,000 is just another way to represent that. That you have this huge number of people, all these people from all these different places, brought together under one banner in Jesus. That is seemingly the meaning of all of this. So it is not, once again, a mass conversion of Jewish people, as much as we wish that would happen, nor is it a literal number of the amount of people who will be in heaven while everybody else is on earth. Those doctrines just do not match what this is describing to us, and for that matter, it doesn't match what the rest of Scripture teaches us either. So having said all of that, we have a little better understanding of the numbering here. What about the latter part of the chapter? So how do we understand, starting in verse 9, what is taking place? Because it does get to be kind of hairy with some of these details. So we have all these servants who are present. They've all been sealed. They've all been identified as belonging to God. And notice in verse 9 what they do. They stand before the throne of God and before the Lamb, which is Jesus, and the one on the throne, of course, is God. And they're clothed with white robes, and they have palm branches in their hands. Now remember, we already know what the white robes mean from chapter 6 of Revelation, starting in verses 9 and going through verse 11. The white robes are a symbol of purity, that they have been washed, they have been purified, that God has given this to them in that respect. So we already know what that means. The palm branches are representative in Greek culture specifically, so maybe not in Jewish culture, but certainly in Greek culture, are representative of victory. So that's what is depicted here in verse 9 specifically. You have purity and victory coming together for the servants of God. And all these people come from all these different backgrounds. Don't miss that detail in verse 9 as well, that they're from all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues. So no one is out of view here if they are part of God's faithful. That again is the meaning of this. And then in verse 11, or actually in verse 10, we see them praising God. They're giving him glory for his salvation. And then in verse 11 and going down to verse 12, you have the angels joining in this chorus of praise. So it's again a worship scene. You have all this praise, all this glorification of God going on because of his precious gifts, because of his goodness that he shows to his people, because of his care, even amidst judgment and condemnation. And then verse 13, one of the 24 elders turns to John and asks him a question. So he asks them, who are these people? I've always found it kind of interesting to read that because John in this situation surely was quite confused. I mean, throughout the book of Revelation, there's moments that you get the impression he doesn't really understand what he's seeing. So for the elder to ask him that question, I would say it's really to get him to think about it, for him to understand what's going on, for him to seek clarity. And that's precisely what he does. So who are these people in these robes? Who are these people that John sees on this occasion? Well, starting in verse 14, we have the elder's response. He says, these are the ones who have come out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, that phrase, great tribulation, again, is something else that is abused to unfortunate effect for a lot of people. That's used to describe a singular event of tribulation that'll happen before the end of time and all of this. That's not what's in view here. Because again, this is describing things that have already been going on by the time this book was written and things that will continue on in the future. The Great Tribulation is any period really of persecution, any period of intense persecution, and that has happened quite a few times throughout history. I think that's why sometimes there's that temptation to view it as something that's still yet future, instead of seeing it as something that's happened in the past and continues to happen into our day as well. But nevertheless, the Great Tribulation could describe any number of periods of persecution, but I would say in this case it's specific to what was happening in Asia Minor in the first century with what they were facing and the amount of suffering that they had. But the point is not on the tribulation. The point is that they survived that. Maybe not physically, because as we saw in chapter 6, they were in some cases killed for their faith. So maybe not physically they survived it, but certainly spiritually they survived it because they did not give up on God's service. They continued to trust in him. And now, verses 15 through 17, God rewards that trust. He rewards them for their faithful service. They are close to God. Notice in verse 15, they are in his temple. They're before his throne. They are closer to God than they have ever been before, than they ever could have been in the flesh. They serve him all the time. And the one who sits on the throne dwells among them. They have fellowship with God in a more significant way than was possible in the flesh. In verse 16, it says they don't hunger anymore. They're not thirsty anymore. They're not wearied by the sun and its heat. There's divine protection over them now. All of their needs are met. They have everything they could need and anything they could want. And then verse 17, the Lamb in the midst of the throne is going to shepherd them. He's going to lead them. Interestingly enough, you have a lamb depicted as the shepherd here. But again, we understand why that is because Jesus, of course, is the good shepherd. And he leads these people to fountains of living water. So he leads them to where they need to be. He takes care of them. He provides for their needs. All that's being described here, that they don't go without. And then finally, we have that description in verse 17, what likely resonates with us more than anything else. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Now, I'll mention here, and I have these references on the slideshow here, this harkens back to Isaiah. So Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 10 is what connects to verse 16, and then Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 8 connects to verse 17. So you're seeing the Old Testament brought in even with this description as well. But what's the point? The point is that God knows his people. He knows what they've suffered, and he also rewards them for that. It's not lost on him. He doesn't look at that and think, well, it was only right for them to do that. I mean, couldn't they have done more? That's not the mentality that God has toward his people. He knows what they've been through. He knows the suffering they've been afflicted with. He knows how bad it was. And he rewards them richly for the suffering and the service they offer to him in their lives. We know what it's like to suffer. Everyone listening to this, you know what it's like to suffer. Suffering is horrible. None of us likes it. None of us should like it. It's not good to desire suffering or to look forward to it. That's not at all something that's healthy. So we know how bad suffering is. But imagine a situation where suffering isn't even a factor anymore, where that's all past. It's a distant memory. It's something that we can look back on, but we never have to worry about again. The same is true of hunger, of thirst, of being wearied by the heat. All of these things being distant memories for the people of God in glory. What a beautiful thought that is. How wonderful it is to think about a time where such is possible, the reality that such is possible. That is the message that the Asian Christians needed to hear the most. Remember the seven churches when you read this chapter. Remember what they were enduring. Think about the church in Philadelphia. Think about the church in Smyrna. Think about the Ephesians. All these people that we're talking about in the seven churches. Think about what they were enduring and putting up with for the service of Jesus. Did they not need encouragement? Did they not need something to help them continue on in God's service faithfully, to correct the problems that they were facing so they could be faithful and see the result that we've been talking about here in chapter 7? This chapter is meant to be one of encouragement. It's meant to press us forward and help us to understand that what we're doing is worth it, that there is a reward at the end of it, that we may not see it right now because of all that we're dealing with and enduring, but man, there is something beautiful waiting for us at the end. And that is the message ultimately of Revelation chapter 7. It's that God knows his people, he knows what they've endured, and he will reward them richly. And not only a handful of them, not only the people who came and were faithful for 50 or 60 years, or whatever the case may be, however we want to divide that up in our mind, this chapter has depicted to us every one of God's faithful servants, no matter their background, no matter where they're from, no matter what language they speak, it doesn't matter. They will be there if they were faithful to him in this life. That is what matters. And Revelation will continue to stress that point. It will continue to show that point and help us to understand the need for faithfulness, the need for obedience to God's commands, to look forward to the beautiful eternity that awaits us. That's all we have to say for right now on the book of Revelation. We'll continue our conversation in chapter 8, hopefully next week, and we'll see the seventh seal opened, and then the seventh seal is going to reveal the seven trumpets, and that'll be the next major section of Revelation we're going to talk about. As always, I thank you for your time and attention to this lesson. I hope it's been enlightening to you on this chapter, hopefully clarified some points about the 144,000 and the Great Tribulation. We got two birds with one stone, so to speak, with that one. So hopefully it's helped you with those topics, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.